Crysis 2 is a perfect example of what's wrong with the video game industry that produced it. And these problems are no closer to being solved than they were in 2011. Not everything wrong. It's not like we're talking about Madden or FIFA here, though all three are published through the same company, and that really should tell you something all by itself. Even fans of EA's licensed sports games will admit they've been stuck in a rut since 2002, with only the most superficial of updates to show for the last decade and a half of quote-unquote innovation. Except for those off years when whole sections of the game disappear, cut to meet deadlines or hardware limitations. Doesn't matter, they still sell millions of copies each year like clockwork on name recognition alone, with the previous year's entry pawned off on younger siblings. And I wouldn't mind, except this has taught EA that there's a massive global audience of undiscerning consumers for their glorified shovelware. And I wouldn't even mind that if EA didn't insist all of its partners and subsidiaries target that same audience. That's the kind of business model that inevitably leads to games like Crysis 2, which shares so many elements with a much better game of the same name that I can't help thinking how good it might have been. Not Crysis 1 good, obviously. The two don't share near enough for that. But it might have become something more like the #1 first-person shooter its marketing hyped it up to be before release, were it allowed to be something other than, well, this. Welcome back, then, to the far-flung future year of 2023. And you are U.S. Force Recon Marine codename Alcatraz.
Tell him, Alcatraz.
Alcatraz ain't talking much this morning. Contrary to popular belief, people, tequila is not good for your health.
Before you meet yourself, though, the Expository News Network has to catch us up on our story so far. It's 3 years after the Korean-American alien war over Langshin Island, and things have not gone well for the human race in the meantime. Turns out those aliens, now called the Seth after their superficial resemblance to cephalopods, left more than one derelict starship buried in the Earth all those millennia ago. In fact, there's been one straight chillin' underneath Manhattan all this time. And isn't that just the damnedest, most convenient coincidence in the universe? It's almost as if the developers, after making 2 shooters set in tropical jungle islands in a row, picked the first, most obvious concrete jungle that popped into their heads when it came time to choose a new setting. The Predator franchise did the exact same thing for pretty much the same reason back in the early 90s. Leading to an excellent comic book miniseries that was excellently novelized by Nathan Archer, both of which are called Concrete Jungle. No relation to the PlayStation 2 game of the same name, thank the gods. So the Ceph, evil ancient aliens that they are, have cleared out most of Manhattan with a supercharged form of Ebola that breaks people down into their ooey-gooey component parts. The better for the Ceph to recycle them into drone soldiers we can shoot. First, though, you have to watch your entire team of fellow Marines get wiped out in the opening submarine crash. Right. This is a sequel, after all. The kind designed to wrap Crysis 1 players in a nice blanket of familiarity while simultaneously drawing in a new console-based audience for their previously PC-only brand. The submarine crash reduces you, stereotypical silent protagonist that you already are, to a barely alive lump of broken bones and ruptured organs. After a brief blackout, you/Alcatraz wake to find yourselves encased in a supposedly souped-up version of the first game's nanosuit. The very same one worn by your/Nomad's old squad leader, Prophet, who somehow made it all the way from the Philippine Sea to NYC, only to come down with the Manhattan virus. Choosing to shoot himself in the head rather than waste away to human bean juice, Prophet charges you, via recording in the suit's HUD, with completing his mission. You must find a scientist with information crucial to stopping the Ceph, and keep him alive long enough to send that info up the chain. Too bad the chain of commands becomes so muddled. With a virus loose in the streets, breaking social order over its figurative knee, you wake up in a city under martial law. Its streets patrolled by employees of the private military company Cell. Your fellow Marines do pop up a little later, and while they act at least somewhat reasonable, Cell, and especially its commander, Lockhart, considers Prophet, and thus anyone wearing his suit, to be a walking biohazard, and orders are to shoot you on sight. Since you're a silent protagonist, you can't very well tell Lockhart he's got the wrong man, but late-game events make it pretty clear Lockhart's way past the point of appreciating life's subtle nuances. He thinks your suit is the key to victory, so he'll gladly sacrifice whole platoons for the chance to peel it off your hide. Irony being, he's entirely correct in this assessment. Over the course of the game, you come into contact with Jacob Hargreave, co-founder of the company that made your suit, Hargreave Rash Biotechnologies. You get it. Rash. 'Cause rash. Action. Yeah? No? Is that just me overthinking? Okay, whatever. After a few levels of listening to him as the standard voice over the radio, you find out Hargreaves a 100-plus-year-old scientist who built his company, and your suit, out of Ceph Tech, salvaged from the impact site at, where else, Tunguska. He was there back in 1908, when a so-called asteroid wiped out all those acres of forest, and he's been preparing for a full-scale Ceph invasion this whole time. The entire cast of the first game, including your avatar Nomad, were not but pawns in Hargreaves' anti-Ceph machinations. And like any king worth his throne, Hargreaves got no qualms about sacrificing yet another pawn, if, as the kids say, it's for the win. A needlessly convoluted follow-up to the Battle of Lang Shin, answering a grand total of none of the questions its predecessor left open. They aren't in the expansion pack I mentioned, Crysis Warhead, either. That thing's just a side story, its events occurring parallel to the base game, and concluding right before the base game's final level.
Glad you made it, Psycho. Where you been?
Believe me if I told you, mate.
If you want to see what happened after that hard cliffhanger, how Prophet got in a position to save Alcatraz's life, or the final fates of Nomad, Psycho, and Dr. Rosenthal the Younger, or how the hell no one noticed an alien starship under New York besides one crazy old scientist, well, tough shit. You'll have to read the 6-issue comic book tie-in series published in conjunction with this game. I haven't seen this much crucial information left out of a story only to be put out in a comic since J.J. Abrams' first Star Trek movie. Oh, you want to find out the villain's motivations? Well, that'll be $5 extra, please. 20 if you want the whole story. Cheapskate. Why are you so cheap? And like any Abrams production, plot twists pile on plot twists like the enemy AI piles on you if you stand still too long. Cell's second-in-command was actually an undercover CIA operative this whole time. And she's the daughter of Principal Strickland from the first game. You're supposed to care, I guess, because her father spent 4 levels yelling in your ear before he got owned by a giant crab robot monster. About halfway through, the US military gets sick of Cell's shit and revokes their authority. But take a wild guess how many fucks Commander Lockhart gives, or what this does to his overall mental state.
Do I have to do everything myself? You are elite soldiers. You are equipment. Will somebody grow some balls and kill that tin fuck for me?
If you played Warhead, you might remember Lockhart's nephew was up for the nanosuit program. But something went wrong during the recruitment phase, and Nomad got his slot instead. If you didn't play Warhead, then Lockhart comes off as yet another crazy PMC commander being the antagonist in a video game. Dead set on killing the player character because, well, shit. We need some kind of human v human conflict, don't we? Something personal the player can relate to. Turns out your suit, far from being the thin skin of shape-shifting machines it was in the first game, is actually symbiotic. Perhaps even a life form in its own right. Hell, by the very, very end, you learn, on top of everything else, that Prophet is still alive. After a fashion.
Keep player protocols engaging. Rerouting systems. Wake up, Marine. This is no time for dying. Get your ass back in the fight.
Either the suit copied his personality into itself before he punched his own ticket, or it's doing an imitation fine enough to pass any Turing test. Either way, I can't find myself too terribly bothered by this bit of body snatching, because Alcatraz was never interesting in the first place. Never surprised me to hear characters call me by his name, since Alcatraz has about as much character as the can of Spam in your cabinet. Yeah, you forgot about that Spam, didn't you? Well, the Shadow knows. Because of this, serious identity issues begin to crop up even before that last big reveal. Are we really playing Alcatraz? or an emerging AI subroutine piloting whatever's left of Alcatraz, like some organic jalopy. And what's with the name, anyway? Alcatraz. The Rock. A name synonymous with inescapable prisons. Is that a conscious reflection of the game's design philosophy? If so, it works like a charm, because nothing says linear video game design like a city street's worth of buildings you can't enter. Nothing helps you feel like a rat in a maze more than a sewer level. Or a subway level, though after a certain amount of collateral damage, the distinction gets pretty fine. Or is that name a stealth cry for help from developers consumed by EA and slowly being digested in the belly of that rough beast? I don't know. Those guesses are the best I can come up with.
Your best. Losers always whine about their best. Winners go home and fuck the prom queen.
In itself, linearity's not a bad thing. Points of Crysis 1 forced you into a straight shot? Sure. But I'd argue those were not the most memorable portions of that game. It was at its strongest when its levels opened up, allowing you to discover the many and various paths toward killing or sneaking around whatever was in your way. There were switchback trails, winding rivers, rocky hillsides you could side jump your way up, Bethesda RPG style. It was great, because it provided the illusion of freedom to what could have been just another corridor shooter. Like Crysis 2. Setting the action in, above, and under a half-decimated city restricts design choice by its very nature. You can still jump real good, and plenty of ledges are graspable, making Alcatraz profit an order of magnitude more versatile than his FPS protagonist peers. But more often than not, you find yourself trapped in a hallway. Sometimes it's got an open roof for that liberated feel. Sometimes one wall's been blown off, revealing vistas I'd go as far as to call beautiful, in a depressing, post-apocalyptic kind of way. But hallways they remain. Most with only one exit, past all the cybernetic monsters and/or pissed-off PMC dudes out to avenge the 20 dozen of their friends you ruthlessly slaughtered in the last hallway. Earth's first interstellar war does rearrange the geography as things go on. Right around the time I started getting irritated by all these one-note characters and their sudden but inevitable betrayals/deaths. Not least because I can't speak to them, or even sit back as my character speaks to them in the measured, professional tones of a super soldier, like Nomad. They never tire of talking at me, oh no. Someone needs to do all the fetch questing in this town, and how can I fetch quest without a quest giver? For example, the scientist whose trail Prophet sets you on in the early game is named Nathan Gould. He spends 2 levels hurrying you along through the tutorial, sounding like a burnt-out old hippie the whole time, only to leave before you get to his lab, since Cell's hot on his trail. And like a dumbass, he leaves the location of his new safe house on his hard drive, where any murderous PMC can find it with a few keystrokes.
Jesus, I can't do this anymore. I'm not some Spec Ops hard man like you, like Prophet was. I'm a geek conspiracy nut, for Christ's sake.
Well, then you should be even more attentive to little things like that, the way real conspiracy nuts are. Dumbass. You don't endear a player to a character by immediately demonstrating that character's incompetence. Not unless you're making a comedy, and even then your jokes better not miss. No points for guessing who has to raid Gould's place now that it's crawling with grunts and give the hard drive lead poisoning. Fewer points for guessing this is a blatant setup for a man versus helicopter boss fight. Negative points for correctly guessing that the entire game's paced just like this. One damn complication after another, overriding your previous objective just as you reach it, stringing you along with all the enthusiasm of a hungover tour guide on Monday morning. As opposed to Crysis 1's much better pacing, with its constant upending of player assumptions, provoking emotional reactions to, and, assuming you still have higher brain functions, considerable thought on what it placed in front of you. Like, I don't know, some kind of artistic experience, or something. If I want to be a superhuman monster, wall jumping my way through a New York City slowly succumbing to some mutagenic virus, and patrolled by murderous military types, I could always go back to Prototype. If I wanted first-person post-apocalyptic Americana, I've got 2 Fallouts for consoles set on either side of North America, and I can put 5 more on this computer like that. If I want to have a stealth and shooting spree good time in massive open levels full of purdy visuals, well, I could just play Crysis 1 again. So I switch over to the multiplayer in a last desperate attempt to wring some fun out of this purchase. And promptly get shot in the head by a sniper who's ground his way up to level 50 and unlocked the super awesome railgun you don't get until near the very end of the single-player campaign. It's nice if you're the winning team, at first, but these matches are only 10 minutes long, and repetition is the natural solvent of even the most transcendental fun. That's the inherent problem every sequel has to overcome somehow. Crysis 2 seemed to think moving the action to New York ticked that box off just fine, thanks. But when you find yourself seriously doing something Joe Dante did in Gremlins 2, stop. Think back. Remember, Gremlins 2 was an explicit satire of the lazy decision-making that creates bad sequels. With such consistency and regularity, you can find examples all the way back in ancient Greece. That's why Gremlins 2 is 100% made of such cliches, and why all of them become the butt of a joke at some point. Whether that joke hits or not will determine your opinion of that film. And your need for an incredibly expensive tech demo of a first-person shooter with a dull, dragged-out story and twitchy multiplayer will determine your opinion of Crysis 2. Unless you also factor in EA's decision to turn right around and release Crysis 3 less than 2 years later.